I would like to introduce Dr. Kalidas Shetty. He's a professor of plant sciences at the North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. He will discuss indigenous plant therapies and their contemporary scientific rationale.
Thank you. I'm always very grateful to be here and want to especially thank Mindy Kurza and my special friend Linda Frizzell. It's always reinvigorating to come here and provide a perspective and common threads of our humanity. Also, it was very special for me to meet Beverly Warren, because she's mama of my former colleague, Don Warren. So I had a picture taken and sent it to him, and he replied with a love sign. So what I'm going to do today is first give you, in the first part, overview of the global challenges that we face on especially food security, and especially health-targeted food security, and how climate change is going to impact that, and how we need a much more integrated, holistic approach that has sound scientific rationale based on the ecology of our food system. And many of these threads of knowledge, it comes from our indigenous communities from around the world. So I'll give you an overview of the global perspective, and then in the second part, I'll give you examples of my work here of indigenous foods of North America. And one of my students is here. Jacob, are you here? Yeah, he's one of my PhD students, and you can see part of his work on wild rice here on its anti-diabetic functions. I'll give you an overview. Plant is very central to how we understand food system, and this genesis of plant came to Earth. As you know, our Earth, from what we know, is about 4.6 billion years old. And compared to the life of the sun, which is projected to be 8 billion, we are somewhere in the middle. So considering that concept, when did life emerge? So the early prokaryotic life, it is said, came about 3 billion years ago. But there was a deep freeze for 300 million, and they survived in few puddles and re-emerged 2 billion years ago, again as prokaryotic life. Then the oxygen-based life, and that's very important, in which you, plants, we are all part of that. This oxygen-based mitochondrial life, more sort of a multi-organelle system, came much later, about a billion years ago. So that's what we live, the oxygen-based life. But oxygen-based life that we breathe is guided by how our ecology functions. Our ecology functions, as we see now, with plant-based systems in our food system. But this can only happen when the solar energy splits water. So when solar energy splits water and plants, only then carbon can be hydrated. So this 0.05% carbon that's on the atmosphere, very low amount, which is now, of course, is increasing by global warming. But this 0.035% carbon can only be hydrated when the water is split by solar energy. So that's when the solar energy is captured into a chemical form. That's why we call carbohydrate, carbon being hydrated. So this is very fundamental. So once you follow that, then you can see from carbohydrate, you get the nitrogen, which is 79% on the planet. You get the foundation of amino acids and proteins. And then the carbohydrates get rearranged and you get the lipids. So these are the three major macronutrients of our food system, and then they're cofactors. But these are not enough, and that's where the ecology comes in. Plants are just not based on these macronutrients and micronutrients that is part of our food label. They have been evolved in different ecologies, from the tropics to the tundra, and in each of these ecologies, different populations adapted to that local system and then built their food systems. And so if you go deeper into that, you see that around the plant system, you have the soil. It's not only the photosynthetic process that's assimilated, but without the geothermal foundation, which came from the early emergence from the sun, like all other planets. So this foundation of soil health to plant health, they're very integral to building this equilibrium that ultimately shapes our gut health. This early microbes that were there on the planet is still part of us. So we are now more mitochondrial or higher cell function, but still, without that ancient microbiome, we cannot function. So this equilibrium of the earth to the photosynthetic process is very much required for our physical and cognitive health, and that is what's called the gut-brain axis, and I'll come to this a little later, how the cognitive foundation of us also comes from this foundation. So this plant rhizosphere-based equilibrium is very critical to our food system, and each of our ecologies built this in different ways. So we need to integrate that diversity to build resilience, and especially as we face these climate adaptation issues. So this ecosystem and building resilience within the community requires this photosynthetic soil system to build nutrition diversity. So another very important part, diversity, both microbiome diversity and plant food diversity is very much essential to build not only the microbiome diversity that you need, but also the multi-component food that you need from a wider ecology. Our food is not just the macronutrient and micronutrient that you see on the aisles of the grocery store. It's much more, because the photosynthetic function and oxygen function needs to be very harmonized. So this oxygen that we breathe, we think about food that we eat, but we forget it's the nose that gives the oxygen, get the energy out that originally came from the sun. So this oxygen that's there, that functions on the mitochondrial level, is the very foundation of how we get energy. But this oxygen is very unstable, because on its outer shell, it has got 6 electrons, so it's always trying to grab 2 more as it sort of settles the energy function in the mitochondria. That's when the solar energy that's put into carbon is sort of pulled out again for our needs. So that's where many things get perturbed. And as we take higher carbohydrates and all these excess calories, the first target, as we talk about inflammation, is the oxygen malfunction. Oxygen is trying to keep up to try and get you energy, but it gets out of tune. And when you do not have protective factors coming in from the plant, and you have this refined food, then it sort of degenerates towards malfunctions. One oxidative malfunction to the next, including inflammatory processes and everything else downstream. And eventually you manifest in these different diseases we call diabetes, there's non-communicable chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, eventually cognitive breakdown. So this oxygen is very foundation. How that's coupled is very central, and plants have done an elegant job having feedback loops to counter that oxygen function in their mitochondria. They're autotrophic, meaning they make their own food. So this is very important, because from that, you can see what is the failure of our food system. So if you go to a grocery store, it's macronutrient and micronutrient. And what we have not considered is, how do we integrate oxygen-fighting components that are there in the plants into our solutions, number one. Number two, we don't take high-fiber foods, because in America, for example, we take less than 1 serving per day. So there's no fiber in our diet. And in our indigenous communities, it's 0.5 serving. Even inner city, food deserts, it's less than 0.5. So not only oxygen-fighting compounds from plant foods are not in our diet, but the microbiome to support that is the fiber that's needed to support our good microbiome is not in our diet. So those two elements have to be integrated. And the only way to integrate that is to consider our food ecology and build it all the way from soil health to human health, because it's the photosynthetic process coupled to the soil biology that has created this resilient plants in different ecologies from which we have built our food system. So all those protective factors, particularly these two elements that I talked about, good fiber to support our good microbiome, and the oxygen-fighting, redox modulating or oxygen-fighting compounds, because then you can curb the oxidative malfunction that manifests in different cells from which we call disease as we separate out to different functions, starting with glycemic control, cardiovascular breakdown, ultimately cognitive failure. And I'll come back to this. And therefore, one of the critical platforms that we need to integrate into our food system is to enrich and be cognizant of the microbiome that are ancient part of our Earth's history. From 3 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, that's still part of the oxygen-based life that emerged later. So that's still part of us in our gut. They say it's between 1 to 2 kilograms of each of us is our microbiome. And there are more microbiome in your system than your own cells. So this is very central to, as we think about, and First Peter so elegantly, Alika, so elegantly presented some of the microbiome. So here's a broad perspective where this diet with high fiber, good oxygen-fighting compounds is very central to how we build the microbiome and overall health. And so that's one central part. A second important is the supporting a mitochondria. We're all mitochondrial oxygen-coupled system, species. So we cannot let the mitochondria degenerate. So we need to couple that, because the only gate to new synthesis, cellular readjustment, disease countermeasures is how the mitochondrial energy production and what we call the new synthesis through what's called a pathway called pentose phosphate pathway. Don't worry about the pathway, but there's another pathway that's very central to making new synthesis as we adjust. And that's called the pentose phosphate pathway. So only when this is coupled can we curb the oxygen malfunction that sort of degenerates into different components of disease pathways, whether it's cancer, autoimmune immune diseases, or glycemic control, many of this. So with this background, what we see today, all our major diseases that we see today, coming from high-calorie refined sugars, refined foods, they all link to the oxidative malfunction. That means without coupling what we breathe, we are not going to be healthy. And therefore, supporting the mitochondrial function with good plant-based therapies and integration. So ancestors were absolutely perfectly right. And therefore, if you see all the major diseases, it's built on the inexpensive refined sugars and starts with diabetes, moves towards cardiovascular disease, glycemic control, vascular control, breakdown, some degenerate into cancer or autoimmune disease like arthritic breakdown, and eventually cognition, which is Alzheimer, Parkinson type disease. And therefore, obesity and consequence of aging, they're all part of our oxygen. We can't run away from oxygen on this planet, right? As we have to live on this planet, oxygen function is central, but we have solutions. And what are those solutions? Plants. And they, in every reproductive function and stress adaptive function, have built feedback loops to make a range of compounds in different ecologies, in the cold, in the hot, to sort of build their two survival mechanisms. One is reproductive, and another one is stress adaptation. So in all of this, they have the oxidative countermeasures, and many of those components should be in our diet. Okay. So that's what we call anthocyanins and a whole range of compounds that I won't go into. So these, across every culture on the planet, based on the different ecologies, they have adapted different species, whether it's a Lamiaceae family. There are some in the northern Great Plains, some in India, some in Indonesia. But there's some common threads that each of our ancestors have built based on their wisdom, and there's common threads to that wisdom. So if we take that, the biggest disease that humanity faces today is our ability to control sugar, the glycemic breakdown. And many of the drugs are targeted to these central, like acarbose, to amylase inhibition or glucosidase inhibition. But the good news is it's all in our diet. Our plants can give us those supportive compounds. And so every facet of glucose control, beta cell function, oxidative, microvascular function, blood pressure control, ACE inhibitors, all of this can be found in a whole food system. And so that's what we study, and I'll show you some examples. And therefore, as we look into these different steps in a pathway, we can look to plants, even for areas of gestational diabetes, from maternal health to child health. Integrating sound, redox protecting plant foods is very central. And therefore, if you look at the indigenous food diversity across the world, it's beautiful. It's just amazing. And they has to be the foundation to the gastronomic innovation to fight this biggest challenge humanity faces. And the indigenous communities face more of this. And that is to get food diversity to fight non-communicable chronic disease, food that support the microbiome and fight the negative effects of oxygen, and that means high fiber grain, high fiber fruits and vegetables, very simple, and good plant and animal protein balance, herbs and spices. So these are some functions that can be bought in. And now, to our North American experience. You think about the Three Sisters, it's an elegant food ecology concept. A nitrogen-fixing legume that fixes its own, puts the nitrogen from the atmosphere into the carbon backbone and make amino acids and proteins for you. And every legume has 15% to 30% protein, very rich. So it couples with colored corn, and around it you build the squash and pumpkin, right? So if you go deeply into the analysis of this, and you can, one of my PhD students did this work in 2007. Glycemic control factors similar to the drug acarbose can be found in these Three Sisters. ACE inhibitors can be found in specific pumpkin varieties in variable levels. So if you make a three-sister crop, so you not only have glycemic control factors, but you also have blood pressure regulating compounds and the antioxidants. So all of these fundamental components that need cellular countermeasures are there in this. It's not only a beautiful ecology, but it's a beautiful food system that's very holistic. Okay. So we did detailed study of that in 2007. And we found similar trend in the Andes. One of my students came from Peru. So I suggested, why don't you work on similar concept that's relevant to native Peruvians who, when they come from the highland to Lima, they go through the same burden. So if they can go back to their traditional whole food system, you can build all these countermeasures. And her work also showed that. And then recently, what we said, if that's the case, we have the structure function relevance of how good the Three Sisters is. And this is what should inform modern science as we deal with these epidemics, the traditional food and the relevance of this. And why not we build a three-sister garden in which we can integrate other species too based on similar logic, but we can build a Three Sisters garden logic. So we have done that and shown what are these anti-diabetic, glycemic control, and blood pressure inhibitors in this three-sister garden that we built. And further, if you see some of these old squash varieties, they not only have good glycemic control function, which is the alpha amylase, which is the starch digestion that can be controlled, right? And you can slow down before you allow the insulin to function, you slow it down. So there are a lot of inhibitors in our pumpkin. Not only that, some pumpkins even have blood pressure inhibitors, ACE inhibitors. So we have measured that too. So, and similar, this is Jacob's work. Look at the wild rice that we grow here in Minnesota and compare it to the last time, the Sona rice. So uh, even here, the glycemic function is much higher. I've shown one of those parameters that we measure, but across all the parameters, alpha amylase or alpha glucose, these key steps in the sugar control, they all can be inhibited. And the wild rice does it better than regular rice that we can buy from the store. So likewise, we are working with the indigenous baby food, with the Indigenous Peoples Task Force here in Minnesota, Sharon Day. So through her organization, we are trying to integrate the Northern Plains food system into a baby food design. We now have about 4, and they are going into community production system. So we are picking the right cultivars, optimizing the food processing strategy, integration of synergies, and how then we can look at even moderating the glycemic control, especially as we see young children getting diabetic very early. So can a food design from 0 to 6 years or 6 years to 16 years, how can we integrate these traditional food systems at every stage, including maternal health itself? And we can do that with our indigenous foods of here, of Northern Great Plains. And probably I've been talking to colleagues from Oklahoma and elsewhere. We could build it from each of their ecologies. So with that, we have, this is more of those studies to look at the anti-diabetic factors and into the baby food design. And therefore, not only a three-sister community garden, but everything else, we can build a community-based food for health paradigm based on our own local food system. Okay? And that's, I think, where we are heading to show. And we want this duplicated globally. And so I'm thinking even 2-3 years as new Asia develops. I'm originally from India, and I think the revitalization of indigenous knowledge to inform modern science with the new emergence of Asia is going to be amazing. It's going to be the best next 10 to 20 years for all of us in how we are going to integrate this knowledge into our well-being and wellness. And therefore, what I like to, I don't have much time, we then have to come to human mind. How does this ecology and the human mind works? And this is where my next journey is. So Daniel Kahneman has living on Earth under 2 systems. The fast response, when you drive a car, you got to brake, suddenly somebody comes. So that's your system 1. You need that to survive on this planet, running away from predators, you know. And so, but also you have slow response, like I'm talking now, I'm deliberate, I'm thinking, or making a, you know, suing, or you're making an aeroplane, right? These are all deliberate. And this happened because human beings, as we walked, even though we're only 2% different from our closest, ape ancestors, our cognitive function expanded amazingly. Why? Use of fingers, okay, and language. Okay, so these 2 coupling, even though we're just small difference in genetics, amazing cognitive expansion. So what does that mean? So this, we're only looking at 2 systems, but our ancestors here in North America and elsewhere, they had a 3rd domain. What is that 3rd domain? The ability to observe system 1 and 2. That means your fast response and slow response. We call it meditation, prayer, or they went for 2 weeks into the wilderness. And what is that? It's calming the brain and observing functions. So that domain is very much important, and many cultures have traditions on it, and a lot of it came from plant therapies. And that's very central. And if you look at our big challenges today, pain, lack of sleep, lack of happiness, there's a lot of this gut-mind microbiome interface that's needed. And we need to integrate ancestral knowledge from all over the world because they explored this. They had this. And so how do we bring it to some of the contemporary logic with them guiding this? And so that's one of the, exploring this ability to observe ourselves, the deeper side, is a very important thing. And for an example is amazing. So in India, there's what's called holy basil, a sort of a drink that sort of helps you to calm. And it's linked to an adaptogen compound in it called eugenol. But we have similar logic here with cedar and juniper berries tea, right? And so our ancestors sort of figured this out, but you can see there are common threads to how the scientific foundation is. And therefore, as we look at this calming, anxiety functions, depression, the ability to look at a third domain of who we are is very much important. That's the mind is ultimately the frontier that our ancestors already explored, but we need to look at it from a food ecology, gut-brain function that I talked about. So that, I don't have time to talk today, but also within that, mind and meditation, the calm observer, and when you do this, what does it mean? When you have no time, no thoughts, you allow and you reduce fear, allow flow, at which time you can realize that you can see you have humility to connect, empathy, kindness, compassion, intention and intuition, gratitude and purpose. These are the end products of some of this ability to explore. So that, when you look at a calming approach with intermittent fasting, and again, I don't have time to go into this. So if we integrate these mindfulness approach to our food ecology and our gut-brain function, then we may be better able to manage many of these modern challenges that we have with our body function breaking down with the challenges of our food system. So we need to integrate this into our healthy eating, but it finally comes from the ecology. So don't forget the ecology. This cosmic view is beautiful because it's very logical. And you can see how energy flows from the sun through plant system, right? It's very elegant. It's amazing. And even we talk about global warming. So what is global warming? We have taken long processed carbon, coal and petroleum, and dug it up in 300 years and spewed it. So no wonder the carbon from pre-industrial 0.03% is now 0.035%, and going to be 0.04%, that's enough carbon to capture more solar energy and keep it on the planet. So that's what's global warming. We've dug up our long process life to do that. My last slide. And so with that, you can see this carbon function is very central to not only global warming and the climate change that's coming, but it's the same carbon balance that we call diabetes, we call cardiovascular disease. So this carbon balance is what we need both at the ecological level, and it's the carbon balance is what we need, what is burning us, the oxygen function. It's a malfunction. It's a corrosive function, right? So you're allowing, so it's corrosive at every level. It's at the earth level and our individual level. But the solution is, our ancestors have already shown us. And so this indigenous knowledge from all parts of the world needs to be revitalized because they lived in harmony. And so the more we align these contemporary science advances to the experiences of our indigenous ancestors, the better off we are as we build climate resilient, health targeted food system. So with that, I thank you for your kind attention. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak.